Hello and welcome to Perry Prosthetics Continuing Education Webinar for Physical and Occupational Therapists in Ohio and Michigan. We are thrilled to have you here and appreciate your commitment to furthering your skills and working with the amputee population. Now, before we get started, let's go over the steps to receive your CEU certificate. First, please make sure to watch this video in its entirety. Once you've completed it, click the link in the description below to access the online quiz. After taking the quiz, send an email to the address provided in the description to let us know that you've completed the course. We'll then send you your certificate of completion along with a quick survey for feedback. If you have any questions about the material or the process described in any specific webinar, never hesitate to reach out to us at the same email address, or you can visit us at perryprosthetics.com. Thank you for joining us. We're excited to share this valuable information with you.
Nick is a certified prosthetist and orthotist and licensed in the state of Ohio, and he is the lead clinician in our Findlay office. He'll tell you a little bit more about his role as we get going. Ben Hammond is here. He is to my left. The original intention was he was going to be sitting next to me, but since we had just a little bit of a tech flub, he is here and he can field questions as well. In fact, now listen, we're live, folks. He's right there. You can just wave to the people. Listen, we're all humans. We're people. It's fine. This is a nice, big, happy family. If you are not familiar with us as a company, we get to celebrate our 25th anniversary next year. We have offices in Perrysburg, Findlay, and Ann Arbor. You are experiencing our CARE program, which is education for healthcare professionals, which is all stemming towards outcomes. Our pillars of education are patient safety, satisfaction, efficiencies, and outcomes. Ultimately, guys, we do education so that our patients have the best outcomes possible and that you feel comfortable working with this patient population. So I've done my spiel. I'll be clicking through the PowerPoint. I'm going to let Nick kind of introduce himself a little more formally, and then you guys can ask questions via chat. So thank you guys so much for joining.
Yeah, thanks for joining. As Theron said, my name's Nick. I've got a few titles these days. So I do run the Findlay Clinic. I am the orthotic manager, residency director, doing a little bit of everything. Like Theron said, we both were at a company in Indiana for a while. So I've been doing this for about 10 years, but I came to Perry in 2022. So just a little over 2 years. Everything's been great. And yeah, we love the opportunity to get together and just do a little education, because anytime, we put all of our brains together and just educate on our field, the patients just get a better result and a better outcome. I do love to keep things very informal, which I know is easier said than done in the in-person setting, because you can just raise your hand. But like Theron said, if you do have any questions, just put it in the chat. I want to answer as many questions as you guys have, because ultimately we want to make sure this is a benefit for you and your facility. So don't hesitate to reach out. So today we're going to be talking about suspension techniques, but we're going to cover a few extra topics with the amputee population as well. And really just to kick things off, in case you're wondering, what does it look like for the prosthetist? How do we even get to the point where we're deciding what type of suspension method they need? Well, it all comes from the initial evaluation and patient assessment. So that's when we're looking at the patient as a whole. What activities are they doing right now? What were they doing pre-amputation? What's their strength in both their limb, but also hand dexterity? How good are their hands? Eyesight can play a part in suspension as well. Range of motion, length and shape of limb, which we'll talk about that a little bit more later as to where that can come into play. And again, just looking at the patient as a whole and seeing what suits them best. You'll see as we get further on, at Perry, we certainly have a preferred suspension method that for a good majority of the people is, in our opinion, probably one of the better routes, but it's not for everybody, right? Everybody's going to have their preference. There's always going to be somebody does something in a unique way that maybe the other suspension method works best. So we just do a very, very thorough assessment with all that information we just talked about, but then also I like to get the patient's input. So even if they have an activity that might look good for one thing, but they just say, look, I don't like the thoughts of dealing with the pin. Okay, maybe we go the other route. So getting their input, because at the end of the day, they're also the ones wearing this. All right. Or yeah, you got your clicker.
I got one job. I get to click through the PowerPoint here.
One job. He's already falling behind.
If you need me to do something, just do a real subtle now.
I'm gonna snap every time I want to switch a slide. That's a good snap. I want to see how that sounds on.
It's recorded. We'll go back. It'll be in my
So before we dive into the suspension techniques, this is where, normally I would ask everybody in attendance who's familiar with K levels, but just for those who aren't familiar with K levels, the K level is a functional level that's designated for amputees, and that determines really what type of componentry is available for them, what insurance will approve based on their activity level. It's K0 to K4, and kind of you can see in here the full-blown elaborate description of each K level, but the simplified version, K0, they're not a candidate. Doesn't mean they'll never be a candidate. It just means when we evaluated them, they were not a candidate. So sometimes in those cases, they'll start doing pre-prosthetic therapy. Now they become a candidate. K1, really just think about it as a transfer leg. Somebody's using it to get in and out of bed, in and out of the chair, get into the bathroom. K2 is where most of your brand new amputees honestly start. And the main reason for that is just you think about an amputation and they're going to be down for a while, right? And we lose our strength a whole lot quicker than we get it back. So from being down, their strength just, they atrophy, they get weaker. And the testing that we do to figure out these K levels, called the amputee mobility predictor, well, before they have a prosthesis, they're doing most of these tasks on one leg, which sometimes even if I try to do it on one leg, I might score a K2 depending on the day, right? Because doing something on one leg is hard. It's a lot for one side to take and to balance. So a lot of times your new amputees start there, and that's going to be a patient who's walking at a single speed. They're pretty comfortable in the house. They can be out in the community, but they're going to think twice, when they get to a curb, when they get to stairs. More than likely, they're using an assistive device of some sorts. K3 is going to be most of your active adults. I do like to point out that there's not a specific requirement that a K3 ambulator cannot use an assistive device. Oftentimes, we run into that in our field. Somebody sees a patient with a cane. Well, they can't be a K3 ambulator. They're using a cane. It does not say that whatsoever. There's plenty of K3 ambulators that just feel safer with a cane. And at the end of the day, that's what we want. We want patients to be safe, to be confident, and comfortable with their prosthesis. K4 is just your active, really active adults or kiddos. So high impact stuff, sports, jumping, different things like that. The main jump is when you go from K2 to K3. When you get to that K3 level, that's when you get the carbon fiber feet that have more energy return. You get the knees that have a few more bells and whistles, although there's a recent bill that passed, but you'll have to come back for another presentation for that, or I'm going to run out of time. Darren's elbowing me under the table. So like I said, we evaluate this with the amputee mobility predictor. And I always encourage patients that just because they score at a K1 or a K2 when they're new, it doesn't mean that's where they're at for life, right? Oftentimes, and this is not an exaggeration, I've had numerous times where a patient started at a K2. After 3 months of physical therapy, we test them again. Guess what? They scored at a K3. And if that's the case, that's medical justification to pursue new componentry for the patient. So sometimes, usually it's the guys, we're hard on ourselves and we're like, oh, I can't believe I'm a K2. Well, hold the phone. You just got to go through therapy, build your strength back up, and let's set that as a goal. Let's try to get to that point to where you do hit the K3 mark. So that's the main thing there. Upper extremity does not have K levels. There's still outcome measures that we do just to verify the need and efficiency of the items, but there's not an actual functional test like this that determines componentry. And then we make a point on here about PM&R physicians. A lot of primary care doctors don't feel comfortable with documentation. And in today's insurance climate, which I'm sure you are all familiar with, insurance has a mountain of hoops for us to jump through. And sometimes the PCP just doesn't feel comfortable doing that. We do like to come alongside them and give them a little cheat sheet to make it easier, but they aren't always comfortable. So a lot of times when you have a PM&R physician, they're more familiar with with that type of patient population. And oftentimes we'll have an amputee clinic set up where we send patients to these PM&R physicians, and it's purely for documentation. But they also, walk through them through their amputation process as well to help them with anything that comes up, not just supplies, but also if there's nerve pain going on and things like that. So that's kind of I don't want to say brief. I don't think it was very brief, but a little background leading into it's just the actual meat of the presentation. I didn't even have to snap that time, and he changed it.
Well, you've got me.
He's getting
worried.
good.
No, you got me worried. The minute that we log off, the amount.
Oh,
of
it's gonna be bad.
lashings.
Yeah,
that I'm gonna get.
He's gonna get it.
We'll do a wellness check on it.
So we'll start off with suction and for the transtibial or below the knee level. So this was the suspension method that I said for most patients, honestly, we do think suction is going to be the superior method. You're going to see a lot of these have overlapping components to them. So just to start off, you're going to have a cushion liner, a gel liner that just cushions and protects that residual limb. Socks if needed. So the socks are just going to be used when the limb volume changes. Obviously, the amputee needs to adjust socks to optimize the fit of that socket. And then you have the socket itself. That's going to, of course, be custom made for the patient. We have a fitting process for that. There's a presentation actually that touches on that we can either set up one of these or you can go to, it's on the YouTube page, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So it's also available for you to see as well to get more information of how we go through that fitting process. They may or may not have what's called, one company calls it a gaiter. Really, it's a sleeve protector. The gaiter is just a specific brand of it. That just protects the suspension sleeve, which is that last little circle there. Protects it from the trim lines of the socket. So it extends the life of the sleeve, which is good because as we get into pros and cons, you're going to see the main con is that suspension sleeve. Yeah, so regardless of the suspension technique, the amputee, they need to roll the liner out completely like she just did. You will at one point or another probably see an amputee and they'll leave it dished out and they try to pull it on like a sock. Can it work sometimes? Yes, but it's really easy for them to create a little pocket of air at the bottom of that liner, which can lead to skin breakdown, blisters, irritation. So they really need to just totally invert that liner and then roll it up. You can see she had to put a sock on top of the liner. That's the other thing I want to point out. Socks are meant to be worn on top of the liner. There are special socks that can be worn underneath the liner for friction and sweating, but the actual fitting socks are meant to go on top of the liner. If they add too many underneath the liner, it can actually affect how well the liner adheres to the limb, which can then cause movement in the socket, cause an issue. So you can see she got everything on. Got settled into the socket and then rolled up her sleeve. You want to make sure there's no wrinkles. You always want to make sure there's proper skin contact above the liner. So that sleeve, I always say 1 to 2 hands above the top of the liner, that sleeve needs to grab their skin. So the sleeve prevents air from coming into the socket. And then there's a valve. Sometimes it's hidden. Sometimes you can see it. The valve lets air out. That's how they get that airtight seal. So you can see where that sock is. We would want the finished result, that sleeve, to be at least a hand width above that sock, just to make sure there's adequate skin contact to keep that air out. So if, say she stopped that sleeve right at the edge of that sock, air is going to come in through the top. She's not going to have suction. So then she's going to move in the socket, instability, discomfort, maybe skin breakdown. So pros and cons. Every single thing in this world has pros and cons, right? And prosthetics is no different. So the pros of suction, why we tend to think it's the better route in most cases, is there's that reduced movement within the prosthesis because you have that airtight fit. So typically at those first fittings, when they actually develop suction, they have the sleeve on, I'll tug on that prosthesis, and because I want them to feel how secure it actually is. And when they're about to get pulled out of the chair, they're like, oh, okay, this thing is really secured and held onto my leg. So just to give them that confidence to know that it is secure. And by there being less movement in the socket, a more intimate fit tends to make the prosthesis feel lighter as well. Just because we're really loading that whole limb and everything's staying where it needs to, versus when there's movement, you can the socket can hang off the edge of the limb and then you really feel that weight. Along with that, increased proprioception. You tend to feel like you know where the leg is in space a little better because it's moving less, because it's fitting you better, which in turn leads to improved stability as the patient's ambulating. It really is easy to put on, but the flip side of ease of donning is it's one extra piece, a sleeve, which some patients, that sometimes that's the sole reason they do not want suction. They'll say, hey, yeah, I think suction's great. It feels great, but I'm tired of the sleeve. And that's, again, circling back to the assessment, that's fair. They're the ones that have to wear it, right? I'm not the one wearing it each day. So if they're tired of the sleeve, they're tired of the sleeve. So that's going to be the main con is the sleeve. Like I said, it's one extra layer. Some people don't like that extra compression over the knee. And then primarily with the sleeve as a con is they get holes. And if it gets a big enough hole, it's going to allow air in, the sleeve's bad. Most insurance companies, usually most were approving 6 per year, but there are a few now that dropped it down to 4. 4 is a little tough in a year. 6 is usually plenty for most patients. And there's times that we can work around it. But that's where like the sleeve protector comes into play, just to try to extend the life out of that sleeve so that the patient does have that good proper suction. And then especially when they're new, I think as the sleeve breaks in, this isn't as much of a con, but when they're new, sleeves are pretty stiff. And so they'll have a little bit less range of motion. There's several variations now of the sleeves that are pre-flex to bend with the knee. So that helps right out of the box, it not being so stiff and rigid. It's still stiff, don't get me wrong. But since it has that pre-flexion, it does make it a little easier for the patients. And then as they wear it, it stretches out. They don't notice it as much.
All right.
Okay, so the other option is going to be pin suspension. So a lot of similar parts. Yes, there's still a gel liner, but now it's a locking liner. So if you can see this is where if we were in person, I'd like point at that.
Well, look, I got a mouse.
Oh, they can see that.
They can, yeah, I think they can see that. Perfect.
Technology is crazy. I forgot we're sharing the screen. You can see that. So yes, this piece right here, that's called an umbrella. So sometimes it's like a hard rubber, sometimes it's almost like a plastic composite material, but it's reinforced at the bottom because there's a pin, that guy there, that goes into a lock, that one there. So it has to thread into it. So that's the difference there. Socks, it's the same socks. There's just a hole in the bottom of it. And then the socket, how we get there is the same. It's just the socket's going to have a lock incorporated into it, which the suction socket would not have.
All right, we're going to watch Joe here.
And so how it gets put on is the same. Oh, Joe turned it right side out, and then he's going to turn it out again. I was like, oh man, Joe's about to do this wrong.
Well, listen, there's always a before and after.
Yeah, he all the way out. And now because of the umbrella, you're going to see it doesn't look quite like the suction one where it really domed out. And that's because the umbrella's there. But you want to push it out all the way at the end. And then you want to make sure that pin is really in line with the limb, nice and neutral. If the pin's sticking way up, way to the side, it's not going to align with that lock. So we like to put the lock in the line of progression of the limb. So again, if the lock's smack dab in the center of the socket and the pin's going here, it's not going to work. And you will at some point have a patient, and we never tell them to stomp to get their leg on. But I have seen it. Something's not lining up and they think it's just tight and they're stomping away. Well, I've actually seen them poke a hole in the flexible inner socket because the reason it wasn't going in is because their pin wasn't lined up. But instead of putting their liner on again and getting the pin right, they just kept stomping on it and actually blew a hole through the inner socket. Joe doesn't have an inner socket. In this one, it's just a hard socket, so he's not going to puncture a hole in there. But if that pin's not lined up, you're obviously not going to be able to get it on. If you're ever struggling with that, if you have just some cheap lipstick, put it on the bottom of that pin, have them put it on, and then you can actually see where they're hitting in the socket and know how to adjust that liner. So that way that pin does line up appropriately.
Expensive lipstick is also acceptable, but I just wanted to.
I just hit up CVS. I just buy in bulk. Like I don't know, red. That's what I always get. I'm sure there's a cool color name for it.
And
but-
then you became a prosthetist,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Okay. So I thought.
Yeah, I had the lipstick first. Um, Darren and I should not be interested together. So, pros and cons of the pin. Again, like I said earlier, everything has pros and cons. So, one of the main pros for patients is just there's no sleeve. Some patients really like only having to put on one layer, not having the knee restricted. Some of the locks, not all of them, you can actually hear when the pin engages the lock. So some patients like that, just that peace of mind of knowing, okay, it's in there. I heard 8 clicks. It's all the way on. I'm good to go. They like the fact that they know unless I push the release button, it's not coming off of me. It's nice and secure. They're not worried about, okay, I got a hole in my sleeve. Now air's getting in there. And then more range of motion at the knee, just again, because that sleeve's not there. Cons, the pin can be frustrating. Some limbs can be harder than others. If you have a limb where the end is pretty fleshy, when they go to put it on, that pin can move and migrate, which can make it a little frustrating. And then pin inevitably allows more movement in a socket than suction does. And it's the nature of you've got the pin at the end of a liner in a lock, patient lifts up, the fabric stretches, the limit elongates a little bit. The manufacturers do try to use fabrics that don't stretch as much, but inevitably you still get some of that. Some patients can feel that and they don't like that. The other thing that could be thrown on here is if you have a really bony conical residual limb, small limb, I've had several patients, they can feel that umbrella. And that alone is a reason not to use it. I've seen patients, they might come to us with a locking suspension method, and they're saying they got discomfort at the bottom of their limb, and then you look and the umbrella is hitting right on the edge of their bone. And you can see it plain as day. Well, okay, let's get rid of that. Now it's just nice gel cushioning that limb, pain went away. So that's something to think about as well.
All right. Moving on to above the knee.
All right, so above the knee, it's going to be very similar, just subtle differences. So you still have a cushion liner. The main thing, so sealant is suction. We just call it sealant suction because you can't use, a suspension sleeve for above knee sockets. So what this right here is, that's a sealing ring, as is that right there. So those seals grip to the inside of the socket wall, and that's how we get the airtight lock for the above knee sockets. Now, the main downside of that, not to get too far ahead because I know there's a pros and cons slide, but
You're good.
I'm going to do what I want.
Do what you want.
You only get suction from the seal down. So with the sleeve suspension for below the knee, the whole limb, the whole socket's under suction, right? But in this style, since we can't put a sleeve on there, in most cases, it's just from the seal down that limb's under suction. So it's still good, but it's just not the full limb. Socks are going to be a little different. They're going to be open on both ends because it can't cross over that seal. If the sock crosses the seal, they're not going to get suction. The sock's going to act as an air wick, allow air into the socket. The prosthesis could come off. How we get the socket design, same process, still custom made. And then again, there's a picture of a sealing ring there. Sometimes they're separate. A lot of times they're permanently attached. Just depends on what we feel is most appropriate for the patient.
All right. Got it.
You're going to see the donning process is the same. Above knee liners typically get a little more unique trim just to match the change in socket shape as opposed to below the knees. But he turns it all the way inside out, rolls it on, gets all the wrinkles out of there. And he's in the style where the ring is separate. The nice thing with that is that he can add the ring higher or lower. So if his limb fluctuates, he might find, hey, I'm smaller at the bottom, I'm struggling with suction. If I move the ring higher up, I still have good contact in the socket. Now he still has suction. Now he can keep wearing his socket. So he's getting the sock situated. Way. And he's going to pull on the sealing ring. So yes, it's nice to be able to control where that ring goes. But some people don't like having that extra step. But the flip side is if you get a liner where the seal's bonded, especially when it's new, it can be a little bit harder to roll on because you got to push over that seal. It's just getting it all out, making sure that sock's not going over the seal. And that another unique thing with that seal, it does not require alcohol spray. Most of your seals out there do require alcohol spray to put it on. Alcohol is nice because it dries quickly. You can use hand sanitizer in a pinch, but just use a little bit, and the patient has to wait a little while because the hand sanitizer takes longer to dry. But you can use it if you're in a pinch. So now he was just checking where he's at in the socket, and then he's ready to go.
And an asterisk about these videos, when you watch them on YouTube, they're actually narrated. And they're narrated in a style that the practitioner would be talking to the patient like a normal patient appointment. So it's not only helpful for you as medical professionals, but show your patients as well, because it helps them with terminology and it helps them give a visual of what life is going to be like, even if they don't have a prosthesis yet. So that can be helpful for your patients as well.
Yeah. So pros and cons. So sensitive suction, typically you're going to have less movement within the prosthesis. It's going to feel lighter, increased proprioception, increased balance. And then again, with that specific one in that video, the ability to move the ring. Cons, well, you got to have the hand dexterity to either A, move the ring, or like I said, with the seal and rings that are bonded, they got to have the hand strength to get it over that seal when it's new and stiff. And then the main con, which can pull patients away from seal and suction for above the knee, is breaking suspension. Now, normally it's not a rapid, I've got suction, everything's great. Oh, my leg flew off. It's not usually that. Typically it's everything's good. And then they're hearing air as they take a step, and then they start to feel a little bit of movement. So there's usually more than enough time for them to stop what they're doing, add a sock without it coming off. But I mean, if you put yourself in their shoes, that's a fair fear, right? You don't want to take a step and then your leg fly off of you. But that's why we're big on follow-up care. We're assessing the fit, making sure everything is fitting appropriately. There is proper suction, and making sure the patient's educated on what to look for so that that doesn't happen. And then the alcohol spray. I view that as a con just because if they don't have that one style that doesn't require it, well, really wherever they go, they need to have alcohol spray with them in case for whatever reason they have to take the leg off. They need to be able to get it back on. There are little like travel pen size bottles that a lot of patients get, and they'll just keep it in their car for in case of emergency. But some people just don't like the thought of having to deal with that. So definitely a con for that system.
All right, going into lanyard.
Lanyard.
Look at that handsome guy.
Better believe it.
Oh, you're there too.
Ha! Oh. Classic there. So pieces and parts, again, it looks very similar. But since this is a locking style, because we don't do one for just pin for transfemoral, right?
I will put it this way. A pin for transfemoral exists.
Right.
In my experience,
Yeah.
I've never seen it done effectively. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Normally, you do see some patients with pin lock for above the knee. Normally, it's lanyard, and it's just because you think about the above the knee limb, right? The residual limb, it's a lot softer. And like I mentioned earlier, if you have a soft limb, it's easy for that pin to move in the socket. So it can be hard to get it to line up. So lanyard is nice. It's just a lot easier to put on, which we'll talk about in a minute. So they still have the locking liner. You can't see it, but it still has that umbrella because this strap here threads into it. Socks, same thing. There's an opening for the lanyard, just like there was the pin. The main difference is there's going to be an opening in the socket, and there's going to be a chafe up top for that strap to feed through.
Right.
And then in this corner here, you can see from the top down, that's a puck at the bottom of the socket. The strap goes right underneath that little bar there, out the front of the socket. Rolls the liner on, gets all the wrinkles off. In this case, he needed a sock. I typically recommend folding the strap on itself when you put the sock on, or else the sock's going to keep hitting the Velcro and stick the whole way through. It pops through. He's able to pull it on. That's the nice thing with this system is they're able to get the socket either all the way on or almost fully on before they stand up. So with suction, they need to stand up, shift their weight, work into it a little bit. And so for your weaker, lower activity patients, we don't want them to worry about that. When they go to stand up, I want to know that they're secured and safe in the socket and they're not worried about balancing and trying to work themselves in. For a second, I thought I was wearing the same shirt.
Oh my God, I was waiting for somebody to put it in the chat.
It's a different shirt.
From their perspective, and that it's the same shirt.
No, I'm telling you, it's different. That one has a little bit of pink in it.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a different shirt.
I'll put a poll out,
It's a different
friends,
shirt.
to say.
Trust me.
I really was like, boy, that's embarrassing.
I think we should.
I thought it was gonna be awesome.
I think we should put out there for everybody.
And something interesting to say, I believe this was Alfonso's like initial follow-up.
Correct.
Like it
Yep.
was like days after
Yeah.
his getting it. So
Yep.
that
Yeah, those
video
were
is very
early.
time lapsed.
Yeah, those were early steps for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
All right. Pros and cons. So the main pro I would say is that it can be done in a seated position. Again, the confidence of suspension, just knowing before they stand up, it's on there. And then you do get a little bit of rotation control just because that strap in there. But if it gets, that's why it says when fitting appropriately, because if the socket's loose, even with the strap in there, it's going to rotate a little bit, although it can help it as long as that screw is in there nice and tight. But as always, we want to make sure the socket's fitting appropriately, right? Cons, hand dexterity. They have to be able to get the strap to the bottom of the socket. There is another design where it mounts on the side of the socket. I've used that for some patients with hand dexterity issues that suction wasn't appropriate. And that does help. So still a similar concept, just slightly different. Having to maneuver that strap if that's what we're in. And then just like with pin, there's going to be more movement with this system as opposed to suction. It's not an airtight lock. And that's going to be exaggerated if they're not adjusting socks appropriately.
And he could have done everything in that video on his bed a lot easier.
Correct. It's always harder in the chair because the liner's hitting the chair, the socket's hitting the chair. Putting it on in bed is the easiest, just getting things out of the way. And when for some of the patients that like it tight, which I like when they like a tight socket because it works better for them. I've even had several patients that they'll lay in bed, they'll get the strap in there, and they just fall backwards and pull it in just to get some momentum. You obviously want to make sure it's safe if they try that. But I have had several patients say that's how they do it. They're like, oh yeah, I really sock it up. I like it tight, and I just fall back and pull.
All right. This is one of my favorites. So,
yeah, this one is unique for sure. So this is called the Connect TF. This is a prefabricated socket. So we can fine tune it. So you can call it semi-custom if you want. But it really is, it's a prefabricated device that we just fine tune the tension on. So it's a locking system. There's still socks, but you can see how much different the socket is. So these cords right here, those deal with the tension. So we can adjust how tight those get based on how the patient changes. So you can get a little more longevity out of it. Oh yeah, we got pros and cons, so I'm not going to go too far on that. This lever here, this is what really makes it stand out. You'll see in the video, and we can start the video and I'll just talk over it. So I gotta hit players.
Just hit that little button right there. Yeah.
So the nice thing with this, and the reason why a lot of times pin is hard with a standard socket is it can't open. So even though this is pin system, this one works easy because when that lever's up, the socket opens and now it's looser. So it's easy for that pin to maintain that alignment as he puts it on. So they flip the lever up, the socket expands. Again, in a seated position, just like lanyard, they can now slide the socket on and they can actually see how that pin's lining up through there. So if they did put the liner on wrong, they can see that the pin is at an angle and then they can correct it. They get the pin to engage and they can either stand up and get all the way in it, or that piece right there on the front once that pin is engaged, they can actually turn it and it'll pull the limb down in it as well. But then they push that lever down and it cinches to that tightness that we set it at. So this is primarily meant for low activity amputees. This is marketed for patients that you're on the fence of they're borderline being a candidate, they're pretty weak. And again, they need all the help they can, making the donning process easier. Just since it's so easy to put on in the seated position, or if they're fluctuating, it's nice because you can open it up so donning will be easier if the limb, say it swells up. They might still be able to fit into the socket with this method because they can open it and then get that pin to engage, as opposed to they might be just swollen enough that if it was a standard socket, they wouldn't be able to push through. So something to think about there. Pros and cons. Again, it's ideal for low activity users, easy on off handle. The only thing I've seen with the handle is if we have the tension of those strings too low, the handle is there's not enough resistance on it. But that's something that we evaluate. So if it's too light, then maybe we need to go down a size so that we can adjust the tension of those strings. There is adjustable height for the inside and outside aspects of the socket, so you get a lot of adjustability. Another pro is that the brim or the top aspect of the socket is soft, so it's typically more comfortable. And then again, being able to don it while seated. Cons, like I said, it's not a custom device. So you're not going to have a true custom fit. It's not going to be total contact, but it's not meant to be a forever socket, an end-all be-all device. This is meant for early goings, just to get a patient going. This is great for those patients in nursing facilities, skilled facilities, because it's a lot quicker for us to fit and deliver one of these than a custom socket, right? This is a few screws, tweaking, finding out what comfort looks good, and then having them walk, as opposed to some form of casting, a couple test sockets, then a delivery. So it's great in those settings, but yeah, you're not going to have that custom fit. It's not meant for high activity, so that's going to be a con. A big con, honestly, is the weight. It's a little ironic that it's for lower activity, weaker patients, and it is heavy. But that is just the nature of it, how it's designed. It's pretty heavy, and it's distal end heavy, which makes it feel even heavier than what it actually is. So something to think about there. And then the only other thing is just, since it's not custom in terms of alignment, how everything attaches, it's smack dab at the bottom. So a lot of these lower activity patients have hip flexion contractures, which we have to accommodate. And normally we'll build that into a socket if it's custom made. With one like this, we have to use a big flexion plate that shifts the socket up into flexion, but then also shifts the socket forward so that way the knee stays stable. So that's something to think about as well. Osteo integration, this is a unique one, to say the least. We have, I think, 4 or 5 patients here with osteo. It's unique. So it's a surgical procedure. You can see an implant, goes into the femur. It's a 2-stage process, and it's a long therapy recovery process. So there's a lot that goes into deciding you want to go this route. Not even just from the surgical and recovery standpoint, but also the mental aspect of it, the psychological aspect. I had heard from one of the surgeons that performs this that now they have potential patients. What's the word I'm looking for? Consult with existing patients that have this, so they can see it in person, because he actually had a couple patients who went through the normal consultation process and they're like, yep, we're good. But when they woke up and saw the implant sticking out of their leg, they said, take it out. So they went through all that and thought they could handle it, but when they actually saw it in person, mentally they couldn't take it. So it's a big surgery, right? So we want to make sure the patient is fully educated. We don't rush into it. Make sure they know what they're getting into from all aspects, including the recovery time. So it's pretty slow goings with weight bearing. It's a pretty strict therapy protocol. with how much weight they're allowed to bear through it. But they lose the socket. That's the main thing. There's no more socket to deal with. So comfort, you're not worried about, a socket digging into you. You're not worried about sweating in a socket, dealing with socks. And you're able to really use the musculature, which is great for the limb. It keeps those muscles nice and healthy. There are fail safes built into this, and it's just a quick disconnect. So this piece up here, that's how it connects to their limb. So when they want to take it off, they just spin that, it pops off. And again, when they want to wear it, they just open it up, spin it on, tighten it down. Oh yeah, there you go.
I'm gonna give the people what they want.
They wanted to see.
Listen, there's 45 of you going, oh my gosh, let's just give the people what they want.
No, and even though it's been around for a little bit, it's still gaining steam. It's not meant to be the primary. This is still a unique population that fits this. And really, for a patient to get to this route, they need to show that they've tried traditional socket designs and it's failed. The nice saving grace with this, though, is that it can be reversed. So say they have the surgery done, they have the implant, but they get an infection and it's rejecting it. It's just not going to work. It doesn't mean they now can never wear a prosthesis again. Not at all. They can take the implant out and then just go back to the traditional design. But yeah, there's a lot involved with it. And like I said, I like to make sure from the mental and psychological aspect, they know what they're getting into, and then also the therapy process. Because I know starting off, I think it's only like 5 pounds or something. It's a very small amount of weight they're allowed to bear through it. So, I mean, they're in the bars and therapy has a scale underneath them and they're making sure they're checking how much weight's in there. So it's not surgery's done, incision line's healed, I'm running. Not at all. Because they've got to be able to build up that weight bearing tolerance, and it just takes time.
All right. Last two.
Fitting and alignment considerations. So no matter what suspension method you're in, I kind of touched on this earlier, proper fit is key. It doesn't matter what suspension method you're in, what knee you have, what foot you have. If the fit is not right, you're going to have issues across the board. So making sure the fit's good, whether that's just a simple matter of socks, which honestly, a lot of times socks are the answer. I joke sometimes that it sounds like I'm taking the easy way out because I'm like, add a sock. 90% of the time, it's a sock issue, right? But we take a ton of measurements. So sometimes it's just the proper fit's not there because the limb's changed. They need a new socket. Alignment with suspension. Alignment is going to affect everything too, right? So the big thing with alignment, obviously when we start off, we're trying to optimize that alignment, but the key is recognizing that, especially for new patients, as they go through therapy and get stronger, the way they walk is going to completely change. So we have to keep up with that and change their alignment as they go along, or else the therapists are making them stronger, but now they're getting held back because we're not changing the alignment to keep up with them. So we got to monitor the alignment, make any changes we need just to keep them walking nice and smooth. And then kind of tied with the first one, making sure the patient or even you, keep us in the loop. If you're seeing there's some issues and it sounds like the patient's not letting us know, give us a call. Communication is always the best answer just to get the best results for the patient. We can't solve a problem that we don't know exists, right? And it's happened. I've had a patient come in. He didn't come in for almost a year, and then he came in 30 ply of socks. That is not an exaggeration. I don't know how he was bending his knee. And he said, I just didn't feel like bothering you, right? I could have easily fixed it, but I didn't know there was a problem. So always, always give us a call. Encourage your patient to reach out to us if they have any concerns as well.
Grand finale.
Suspension affecting a patient's gait. So obviously, if you're secured, the patient's going to feel more confident, right? If you're feeling more confident, you're going to be able to relax. You're going to take a more normal step. You're going to feel safer. Your steps on both sides are going to be more symmetric. It's going to improve efficiency because you're not having to work as hard when the socket's fitting inappropriately. Those muscles are having to work overtime to provide the stability that you need to compensate for the loose fitting socket. And just overall comfort, whether it's above knee, below the knee. When a patient's walking, putting their body weight through a prosthesis, if they're not properly supported and secured in the socket, they're not going to be comfortable. And if they're not comfortable, they're not going to want to wear it. So suspension is huge and just overall fit of the socket.
All right, folks. Well, I think we have reached the point where questions have been answered. Education doesn't end here. So don't hesitate to reach out to myself, Nick, Ben, anybody. We're big or small. This is why we're here. So we really appreciate everybody's participation and support. And I hope everybody has a great day.